Respiratory system physiology consists of breathing, pulmonary ventilation, gas exchange between our alveoli and blood, or external respiration, and gas exchange between our blood and tissues, which is internal respiration. The reason we conduct gas exchange in breathing is because we deal with two gases for our cellular chemistry or cellular respiration. In cellular respiration, our cells use oxygen to create energy and run metabolic processes. The byproduct is carbon dioxide. Note, lungs actually have two blood supply systems. The bronchial vessels source and drain the lungs as an organ, whereas the pulmonary vessels exchange and transport respiratory gases. Bronchi, bronchioles, ducts, what you see in the lab, are structures of the conducting zone. Once the structures change to prepare for and conduct gas exchange, then we are speaking of the respiratory zone. The functional structural unit of the lungs and the respiratory zone are the alveoli, microscopic, simple squamous epithelia structures for gas exchange. The 300-some million added together contribute to huge surface area for gas exchange purposes. Alveolar sacs contain elastic fibers for recoil. Gases are exchanged across the respiratory membrane of every alveolus. That membrane is extremely thin. The simple squamous epithelia of the alveolus wall, the simple squamous epithelia of the capillary wall, both stuck together at a fused basement membrane. This is as thin as we can get in the human body and still go between two organ systems. The structure of the alveoli and respiratory membrane are pictured here. Note the three cell types. Type 1, the simple squamous cells for gas exchange. Type 2, surfactant secreting cells and macrophage. Macrophage are the third population. What is surfactant and why is it needed? Alveoli contain water vapor or some water molecules. Water is a unique molecule in that it is very polar or charged. This polarity allows every water molecule to stick to every other water molecule and to the insides of the alveoli. When the molecules do this type of bonding, they create surface tension. This force will cause the alveolus to collapse on itself, as the surface tension creates an inward pull on this thin-walled structure by the water molecules. If we don't try to break up some of this tension, the alveoli will collapse on themselves when we are born. What breaks that surface tension? That's surfactant. Surface tension is a strong force. In the swimmer picture, it is what's causing water to form a film around the surface of the swimmer. Examine the difference between the shapes of two water droplets. You can see the one with surfactant is spreading, whereas the one without surfactant is not spreading. Answer this question in the A&P Cafe discussion board. Why do premature babies, 24 weeks and earlier, have respiratory distress? And what is the treatment? Breathing, pulmonary ventilation, happens when there's a difference in pressure. Let's look at the processes involved. Breathing requires the creation of a pressure gradient between these three pressures. Atmospheric pressure, the pressure of air molecules in our environment surrounding the body. At sea level, atmospheric pressure is 760 mmHg, or 1 atmosphere of pressure. Positive numbers are above 760 mmHg, negative numbers are below 760 mmHg. Intrapulmonary pressure. The pressure of the air molecules within our alveoli. This can be changed, and since it's in contact with the atmosphere, it can become equal to atmospheric pressure. This causes a limit on how much air you can breathe in. Intrapleural pressure. The pressure within the pleural cavity, which is surrounding the lungs. This can also be changed. However, because it is a closed space and never in contact with the environment, it will always be a little less than the other two. A diagram showing us the various pressures. Note, transpulmonary pressure. That's a pressure gradient between intrapleural and intrapulmonary. As long as there are no holes in your pleura or chest wall, this gradient should always be there, which is good because it helps hold our lungs open. If a hole occurs in the pleura and chest wall, we lose this gradient and our lungs will collapse. Note all the pressures. Pulmonary ventilation can be summed up into 4 words: muscles, volumes, pressures, air. We'll be filling this in with details for inhalation and exhalation. Muscles are used to change a volume. That will cause a pressure change. The pressure change creates a pressure gradient, and air will move according to that gradient. Lastly, to make all this happen really requires that we change the inside pressures. The outside pressure is completely out of our control. Before we get into details, we need to understand a little physics. By the time we finish the respiratory system, we will have examined 4 laws. These are the 4 dead guy laws, and we'll take each in turn. Dead guy law is my. Boyle's law really discusses the relationship between the volume of a container and the pressure of air molecules inside it. In fact, these two things are inversely proportional. That means that if volume increases, the pressure inside will decrease. The reverse is also true. A diagram. Imagine the same number of gas molecules bouncing around inside a container. Each time the molecules bounce against the wall, they create a force. That force is air pressure. Now, in a larger container, they will come in contact with the wall less frequently. In a smaller container, they will come in contact with the wall more frequently. The more they touch the wall, the higher the air pressure becomes. What's all this mean? When a container becomes smaller, the pressure inside becomes bigger. How's this relate to your body? Well, the events of pulmonary ventilation cause a change in the size of your container. Inspiration or breathing in. Remember, muscles, volume, pressure, air. To breathe in, muscles. The diaphragm and external intercostal muscles contract. That elevates your rib cage, which pulls the pleura up and out, which pulls your lungs up and out, which pulls your alveoli up and out. Volumes. As your alveoli are pulled up and out, their volume is increased. This is the intrapulmonary volume. So the diaphragm and external intercostals elevate the rib cage, causing an increase in intrapleural and intrapulmonary volumes. Pressures. Increasing the intrapleural and intrapulmonary volumes causes a drop in intrapleural and intrapulmonary pressures. This is the application of Boyle's law. As soon as the intrapleural and intrapulmonary pressures become less than the atmospheric pressure, air follows its gradient. That means air will move from the atmosphere, where pressure is higher, to the alveoli, where pressure is lower. Exhalation, or breathing out. Muscles, volume, pressure, air in reverse order. Now, under normal conditions, exhaling normally doesn't require muscles to contract. The diaphragm and external intercostals simply need to relax. We can then rely on a little surface tension and our elastic fibers to pull the ribs back down, therefore changing the volumes and pressures so that air leaves the body. Have I convinced you that breathing is muscles, volume, pressure, air yet? Sometimes you need to move a larger volume of air. For example, projecting your voice, yelling, laughing, even hiccuping are times when you need to force air volumes. The concept is the same, only we use extra muscles for extra volume, for extra pressure, for extra air. The extra muscles for inhalation are sternocleidomastoid, scalenes, pectoralis minor. The extra muscles for exhalation, internal intercostals, abdominals, and quadratus lumborum. The ease in which this process happens is called lung compliance. If it's easy to breathe, you have high compliance. Several factors affect compliance, and we'll discuss all of these in turn. Gradients. You have to be able to make those pressure gradients to breathe. If anything interferes with the muscles and volumes, you'll decrease compliance. Pain with breathing comes into play here. During an asthma attack, the bronchioles constrict. This decreases lumen size and dramatically increases resistance, making it very hard to breathe. Remember, we reduce surface tension with surfactant. Anything that interferes with that process causes resistance, as will anything that interferes with the lungs' ability to expand and recoil. Here you see scar tissue, mucus building, reduced surfactant, and decreased thoracic flexibility as contributing factors to compliance. Gas exchange. It also uses a gradient, but it is a gradient in the amounts of each gas, or partial pressure. The second famous dead guy law. Dalton speaks of partial pressures of gases. Air is a mixture of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and some other gases. All that adds up to 100%. So if the air is 20% nitrogen, then we say that nitrogen has a partial pressure of 20. This is Dalton's law. Henry's law pertains to the solubility of gases, or how well they dissolve into water. There are several factors affecting solubility. Partial pressure. The higher the partial pressure, the more gas there is, and the more that will dissolve into the solution. 2. Temperature. The higher the temperature, the lower the solubility. Also, gases have a natural solubility limit. For example, CO2 is extremely soluble in water, O2 less so. Nitrogen is practically insoluble. Decompression sickness is an application of Henry's law. Divers breathe pressurized air underwater. That means they're breathing air with nitrogen under higher pressure. That forces the nitrogen to dissolve into the blood. If the diver ascends the water column too quickly, the pressure on that blood drops too fast. This causes the nitrogen to come out of solution quickly and form bubbles in the blood. Not homeostasis, and definitely life-threatening. Now, it's your turn. Try to figure out why a hyperbaric chamber treats this pathology, and you know what to do. Post your response in the A&P Cafe discussion board. Gas exchange. Let's start with the bottom diagram. This is a diagram of an alveolus and the capillary bringing blood to it. As long as you can breathe and your heart can beat, you'll maintain a gradient. Partial pressure of oxygen is high in the alveoli, but low in the blood coming to it. There's always high partial pressure of CO2 in the blood, but low partial pressure of CO2 in the alveolus. Again, each time you breathe, you maintain this gradient. And with each beat of your heart, blood moves into these capillaries for gas exchange. Now the gases are soluble across the respiratory membrane, and they will simply diffuse across the membrane. Which direction will O2 and CO2 diffuse at the alveolus? Now the tissues. Cells that are alive will always use O2, thus producing CO2. So the levels of O2 in tissues is always low. But the level of CO2 in tissues is always high. When looking at the blood coming to the tissue, you can see that this blood is high in O2 and low in CO2, because just a few moments ago it was at the lungs for gas exchange. Now again, gases are soluble across the membrane here, so they diffuse with their gradients. Practice this until you can explain it easily. Imagine that oxygen is food, and food is life. So what makes more sense to you? Have lots of food and lots of life, or not? Hopefully, you choose lots of food and life. The same holds true for alveoli. Remember, their job is to capture oxygen. So we always want to send more blood to an alveolus that has lots of oxygen to capture. We do this with ventilation, perfusion, coupling. Ventilation, the amount of gas reaching an alveolus. A ventilated alveolus has lots of air in it and probably lots of oxygen to pick up. Perfusion, the amount of blood reaching the alveolus. The capillary is perfused if blood flow into it is high. We tie these two things together to be efficient in all of our 300 million alveoli. Now we also don't leave this problem in place. We'll attempt to fix ventilation with the bronchioles. A diagram of ventilation, perfusion, coupling. Again, alveoli with more air get more blood. Alveoli with less air get less blood, but we'll fix that with bronchioles. Now, moving on to how we carry these gases through the blood. Briefly review your terminology regarding hemoglobin. There are several things that affect the amount of oxygen carried by hemoglobin. If you measure and graph this, you'd have a hemoglobin saturation curve. Remember, hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygens at the most. Turns out, the first oxygen is the hardest to load. Once the first one loads, hemoglobin's affinity for the others changes, and the remaining 3 load easily. So, how much oxygen is already bound is a factor. Temperature and pH are factors also. When we get too warm, oxygen is less soluble, and this is reflected in less O2 binding to hemoglobin. The reverse is true when we are cold. Now look at pH. When CO2 levels are high, we become acidic, and an acidic pH decreases hemoglobin's ability to hold on to oxygen. So, this diagram illustrates our last famous dead guy. That would be bore. The pH effect on affinity is useful. When hemoglobin is in a more neutral environment, its affinity for O2 is big, so they bind. This allows for oxygen loading in the alveolus. Now follow that oxyhemoglobin to the tissues. As it enters this area, it's entering a slightly acidic environment from all that dissolved CO2. This changes hemoglobin's affinity and oxygen is released. So you see, the pH change is convenient. Again, repeat this until you can explain it. Now, a little more complicated subject. Erythrocytes carry oxygen and CO2, that's true. They carry oxygen on hemoglobin, but have several ways to carry CO2. Some CO2 just dissolves in our plasma. Some attaches to the globin, but most of it forms the weak acid H2CO3. That comes apart into H plus and HCO3 minus, or hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. This also happens inside an erythrocyte as well as the plasma, and the erythrocyte has to manage that acid but still balance charge. The chloride shift is how erythrocytes solve their dilemma of the acid. CO2 enters the erythrocyte and forms that weak acid. Can you see how the erythrocyte handles it? It hides the hydrogen ion in hemoglobin, then trades a chloride for the bicarbonate. This is why it's called the chloride shift. The reverse process happens at the alveoli. Pause here and explain this chemical reaction. So not only is breathing useful for O2 and CO2 exchange, it also allows us to respond to changes in those gases and even to pH. These are the three critical factors in controlling respiratory rate, or the speed in which you breathe. We constantly monitor CO2, O2, and pH levels and change respiratory rate accordingly. Extrinsic control of respiratory rates. The dorsal respiratory group in the medulla acts as a pacemaker to set our basic inspiration rate. Remember, quiet expiration is a passive process. Need to breathe in faster to hiccup, laugh, hold your breath, control your voice? Now, you override the basic rhythm with the ventral respiratory group. The pontine centers modify these patterns, for example, during sleep. If CO2 is too high, should we leave it high or bring it back down again? If CO2 is too low, should we leave it low or bring it back up again? While we usually think of CO2 as waste, remember always that it is directly tied to pH homeostasis. We use CO2 levels and breathing to control our blood and tissue pH. High CO2 or hypercapnia causes an acidic pH. This results in an increase in respiratory rate until we're back in homeostasis or hyperventilation. Example, when you exercise. Now, low CO2 results in a basic pH. We experience hypoventilation as a result, to bring CO2 and pH back into homeostasis. Example? Panic attacks. People breathe shallowly and much too quickly and expel too much CO2. It can become so bad that the person experiences apnea or no breathing until CO2 levels are restored. So now answer this in the A&P Cafe. I told you in the previous slide why it happens, but how would breathing in a paper bag help here? Overview diagram so that you can see the various chemoreceptors throughout the body. Use this diagram to review what we've discussed regarding respiratory rate and homeostasis. A quick overview on pathology. Respiratory acidosis occurs when there is some pathology in the respiratory system causing an acidic pH to develop. You can see several causes here and symptoms. I will not assess you on the pathologies, but you do need to know what the term respiratory acidosis means. Respiratory alkalosis occurs when there is some pathology in the respiratory system causing basic pH to develop. You can see several causes here and symptoms. Again, I'll not assess you on the pathologies, but you need to know the term respiratory alkalosis.